Hello everyone, I am Cameron.
And I'm Owen.
And today we are bringing you the first and only episode of the Rhetoric Review podcast.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II and how this period in history has not only shaped the lives of many Americans and continues to have effects today, but also why the inclusion of marginalized perspectives is so important. Thank you all for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy. First, I'd like to thank Lena for joining us today. Lena's family was imprisoned at the Heart Mountain internment camp during World War II. We're also really excited to have Cameron share some of her personal experience as it relates to the camp since she grew up in Powell, which is near the Heart Mountain camp. But first, we want to give the historical context of the Japanese American imprisonment and make a few connections that will hopefully be helpful to the listeners. So, Cameron, what exactly caused this event from the historical side of things?
Thank you, Owen, and I would also like to thank Lena for joining us today. The history of the Japanese internment camps essentially begins with the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service on December 7th of 1941. This attack sparked rage among all Americans, but this anger was unjustly placed among Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants. Not to mention, they were also angry about Pearl Harbor being attacked. Proclamation 2525, Executive Order 9066, and Public Proclamation No. 4 allowed the detention of everyone of Japanese descent in the United States. This began the plans for building the 10 relocation centers. Because of these decisions, people of Japanese descent had to pack up their lives into one suitcase. All belongings, property, and valuables, including pets, had to be given away or sold. Imagine that for a second. Some military person suddenly comes into your house and tells you can only bring one suitcase worth of belongings. Everything else has to be left behind. Your house and any belongings that couldn't fit within one suitcase. You have no idea where you are going, what to expect, so you don't even know what to pack and prepare for, or how long you'll be gone for. You don't have time to say goodbye to your pets or any friends, and you don't even know if you'll see them again.
I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been for them. How long did it take them to get to the camp?
They rode on a train for 4 days and 3 nights to get to the Heart Mountain internment camp. As you can imagine, a camp built to hold 10,944 people, constructed in only 60 days, was not a very pleasant place to live. The wood used was very cheap, freshly cut pine, so when the wood dried, all the buildings warped, which made them creak in the wind, and they were less waterproof. Also, most of the people who were forced to relocate to Heart Mountain were originally from California, and they were not prepared for the cold winters. These 10 relocation camps violated the basic constitutional rights of over 120,000 people. There were no trials or any criminal charges against any of them. They were imprisoned only for having Japanese ancestry.
Thank you, Cameron, for introducing some of the history and context behind this story. And again, we really want to thank Lena for joining us today to give some of her personal and family experience as it relates to our topic, because some of her family members were imprisoned at the Heart Mountain camp during World War II. So the question that I have for her is, did the imprisonment event create generational trauma?
Yes, absolutely. And we're still learning about what that looks like. But I guess to start, the first generation were the people that were recent immigrants from Japan, and that generation is called the Issei, and that's Japanese for first. And the Issei generation were the ones that were adults and parents frequently, and they were the ones that really lost everything. It was so shameful for them to have lost everything, so traumatic for them, that they just buried everything. When they spoke to their kids, they made sure their kids were speaking English. The second generation, and the first generation was my great-grandparents. The second generation is called the Nisei, and they were mostly born and raised in the U.S., and they only knew what it was to be an American. And so they experienced the trauma in a different way. Most of them were children or teenagers or young adults, and going to camp for them, especially the younger ones, wasn't necessarily a terrible thing because children tend to be resilient. They really felt like they had to prove their loyalty to the U.S., so they didn't speak any Japanese. Most of them didn't speak Japanese. We lost our language within that generation. They also didn't talk about the experience of incarceration, but they also, like I said, really wanted to prove their loyalty and say, hey, that happened. That was Japan. We're not Japan. We're Americans. And they felt a very strong desire to prove that they were Americans. So that's the second generation. The third generation is my mom's generation, and they're called the Sansei, which means third in Japanese. And they experienced it differently because their grandparents and their parents never talked about it. They never talked about camp, but they knew there were secrets. And so they also had this pressure on them from their grandparents and their parents to be ultra like adjacent to white Americans and really excel in proving their loyalty to the U.S. So a lot of them were very well educated, highly educated, but really didn't know much about their background. And then the fourth generation, which is my generation is kind of like, well, we know that this stuff happened, but we don't know much about it. And we're kind of like, you need to tell us what the hell happened to us. And we need to stop being silent about this. And when we learn more about it, we're like, this was wrong. And whereas previous generations knew it was wrong, knew it was unjust, knew it was unconstitutional, they didn't talk about it. And it was with the Sansei generation later in life, and now my generation and younger generations, we are experiencing, recognizing that there's been trauma passed down to us that we didn't realize was related to what had happened, and we're pissed about it, and we have to we're like we have to address this now because we're still experiencing the effects of the trauma that happened to our great-grandparents and our grandparents.
Lena, when we had spoken a few days ago, you had mentioned that your great-uncle Clarence, who was part of the 442nd Division, had been imprisoned at Heart Mountain. Could you elaborate on his story, please?
Yeah, so my great-uncle Clarence Matsumura, he was imprisoned at Heart Mountain, and people that were of Japanese ancestry, Japanese Americans that were U.S. citizens for a while were not eligible to serve in the U.S. military. They were deemed as enemy aliens. But after several months, after a while, the U.S. government decided, well, actually we're losing a lot of people and we need them. And so they changed their status from enemy alien, and then that meant that Japanese Americans were eligible for the draft. And so my great-uncle Clarence, while he was at Heart Mountain, he was drafted into the U.S. Army as part of the 442 Regimental Combat Unit. He was near the end of the war in 1945. He came across a bunch of Jewish prisoners that had just left Dachau that were accompanied by the Nazis, but then had been abandoned by the Nazis. My great-uncle Clarence, along with his comrades, were the liberators of this death march. So it was really ironic that here he had just come from an American concentration camp where his family was still incarcerated, and here he was liberating a Nazi concentration camp, coming upon a Nazi death march, and liberating the prisoners from Dachau. The beautiful story behind it is that one of the men that he liberated was named Sali Ganor, and 50 years after the day of the liberation, the two of them, Clarence and Sali, were reunited, and they both sobbed and became, from then on, were close friends.
I had watched that video that you had sent me a few days ago, and I saw that Sali Ganar had actually written a book called Light One Candle, where he discusses how, his imprisonment in Dachau, and how Clarence was the one who found him and was the first person to help him. So it's really interesting. I actually bought that book.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so I'm excited to read
good.
that.
that's a really incredible story. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes, thank you, Lena. There's a lot to unpack there. That's an incredibly powerful story. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Actually, I was fortunate enough to go to Dachau. I went on a study abroad trip in 2023, and we went to Germany and Poland. We went to 3 concentration camps, and one of them that we went to was Dachau. When I got back home, my plane landed in Cody, and while driving home to Powell, I still felt so focused on the class, so I pulled over at the Hart Mountain Internment Camp. While walking around the unkept buildings, I kept noticing the similarities of the concentration camps in Germany and Poland and the relocation camps in the United States. Both groups, and by groups I mean Japanese people in the United States and Jewish people, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti people, and more, during Nazi Germany. Both groups arrived by train after days of uncomfortable travel. Both groups were assigned numbers, both were forced to live within a camp that they could not leave because of barbed wire and guard towers with searchlights. Both lived in shrewdly built barracks, and both were imprisoned in concentration camps based on discrimination and racism.
Well, that's a really interesting connection. I want to bring up a specific example of media used in the United States that fueled the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. In 1942, a cartoon by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, was featured in the New York newspaper PM. I'll paint a picture of it for the listeners. There's a stand where TNT is being handed out to a huge line of Asian Americans on the West Coast. A guard uses a spyglass to see across the Pacific, implying he's looking for a signal. There are quite a few dehumanizing racist tropes at work in this cartoon. First, the Japanese Americans depicted in this cartoon are all pretty much identical. Each character has the same clothing, the same hat and glasses, and the same happy, gleeful expression. This depiction de-individualizes Japanese Americans by removing personality completely. Second, the title, Waiting for the Signal from Home, implies the United States is not the home of Japanese American immigrants, despite Japanese Americans having legal citizenship. Finally, the ceremonial handing out of TNT that is depicted in the cartoon implies that all Japanese Americans intend to sabotage the United States. These tropes together form a dangerous trifecta. Generalizing a group as having no individuality, not belonging in a certain place, and having dangerous intentions convinces the audience that inhumane treatment against that group is justified.
It is quite dangerous to have that type of rhetoric spread to the public eye, because then they start believing that it's that naturalization process. While public attitudes directed towards Japanese Americans have shifted since the 1940s, there is a current resurgence of hate crimes and discrimination towards Japanese Americans, and more broadly Asian Americans since the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, research by the Vital Statistics Cooperative Program, which records the yearly rates of infant mortality and is used to indicate a nation's overall health. I bring this up because between the year 2020 to 2021, the infant mortality rate for Asian women in the United States rose by a shocking 17%. As to why it rose, it's not clear. It could be stress on the mother from racial discrimination, it could be neglect of Asian women in labor by medical staff, but regardless of the cause, it is indicative of an increase of racial discrimination against Asian people during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Overall, we hope that we've shown that the inclusion of marginalized perspectives in the mainstream is really important to preventing current and future forms of discrimination. Stories like the imprisonment of Japanese Americans are a sobering reminder of how easily structures and institutions can use their power to discriminate and create violence. As good citizens, we should always strive to implicate ourselves in the fight for the common good, and as rhetoricians, we should also analyze the information that's directed toward us and to do so very carefully. Through these processes, we can break the trends of racism and discrimination if we're determined enough.
As a resident of Powell, I feel that it is part of my duty to pass on this information and educate others about the Hart Mountain Internment Camp. Not many people know the history, and I think that it is important for us to learn about the history of this country, the good and the bad, as we won't know how to evolve without understanding and learning from our past. Lastly, I would like to thank Lena for joining us today and adding her insight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks for doing this project.